Well before our telescopes could take a close look at the real estate, humanity was already being sold grand visions of an adventurous life in the great beyond. Soon we would ride on robotic horseback through landscapes that recalled Utah's Monument Valley, but on Mars. We would orbit the Earth in suburban tract homes, transplanted to space stations. Space was our destiny. All we had to do was manifest it. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. Since the advent of the telescope, humanity has been afforded increasingly precise visions of a vast universe. But each time our technologies of extraplanetary perception grow more powerful, our notions and depictions of the great beyond collapse. As we see more, we must reinvent what we know, dispelling the illusions of our beliefs. As a historian of space imagery, Lois Rosson studies how we picture places we've never been. In the 19th century, photorealistic paintings of vast, unoccupied territories pitched people on the romance of the American West, sight unseen. A century later, before our telescopes and probes began to send back torrents of data from space, artists filled the void, painting alien worlds that looked uncannily like our own, only emptier, and there for the taking. Space imagery is never solely technical. It inspires culture, it steers politics, it dictates cosmic aesthetics. The raw data of our most powerful telescopes can't be seen with the naked eye, so we render it, conjuring color, giving form to content, deciding which way is up, literally. That curation has consequences. Rosson traces the story from art to science fiction to photography and links it to the present, where commercialization of space is reviving frontier myths with fresh capital but familiar tropes, and forward to a future where we will rely on artificial intelligence to render the cosmos legible. Rosson is a historian of technology and visual culture who works with NASA's History Office. She sat down with Claire Webb, director of Berggruen Institute's Future Humans program, to talk about nostalgia, image making, and the visual language we evoke when we imagine the stars. And now, Lois Rosson and Claire Webb on Futurology.
Lois, it's so nice to see you again, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here.
You are a multi-talented person, and you have your tentacular creativity everywhere. So I want to begin at the beginning. So I know you're a painter and an artist now. How did you become interested in that as a child?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I was kind of a late bloomer in that sense. It really wasn't until I got to college that I got interested in painting. And the thing that I was really interested in was if you spend a lot of time on a painting and you make it really exacting and like realistic looking, right? Which I think is itself a fascinating categorization. Like, what does it mean for something to look real? And you spend all this time painting this glass of water or a glass of water, and then you take a photograph of the glass of water, and somehow, no matter what's in the image, the photograph is the more trustworthy representation. And so that was something that I just got really fascinated with. And so I was really drawn to portraiture. I was really drawn to landscape painting and still lifes, which are kind of, I think, as far as representational art is concerned, sometimes sort of boring formats. But I was really fascinated by, what does it mean to try to capture the essence of something.
Who's your favorite still life painter?
Oh, well, that's interesting. I don't have a favorite still life painter. I have favorite painters who paint still lifes. But I think I've actually been the most drawn to, for this reason, to portraitists. I think the most moved I've ever been was the John Singer Sargent room at the Met, because his portraits have this just incredible clarity to them that I felt like I was gazing on his sitters in this very material sense, in a way that transcended what a photograph could capture, right? And I think that what was so moving to me about that moment was, if you consider visiting a place like the Grand Canyon, right, or some other sublime natural landscape, and you try to photograph it, right, like there just is something about the experience of that encounter that it just does not actually translate. And so I felt like these portraits really captured that missing third piece. And, again, as to what I was just saying, right, like, it sort of challenged this contention, right? That like, photographs are like the most trustworthy documentation of a thing, right? Like, can you say that a photograph is a more accurate documentation of the experience if it can't quite approximate that human experience of the encounter?
So Singer Sargent was an American painter, early 20th, late 19th century, and of course he has this. I will say the word iconic, this iconic portrait of Lady X.
Yeah.
You want to describe that for us and how you felt her essence? At the Met.
Yeah. I mean, it's a striking painting. I think, especially if you contextualize it in other portraits of the time. My understanding is that it was very controversial when it was painted because it's kind of sexy.
Yeah, and, it's still sexy today. She's wearing this super low V-cut black velvet dress, and she has this haughty look about her, and she's bearing her chest in this way that was completely outside of the norms of portrait painting of the time.
Totally.
And so, Lois, what I'm picking up from your work is how representations of objects in the world are layered by their historical anchors, right?
Yeah.
And you're particularly interested in how outer space is depicted.
Yes.
And of course, outer space, it's out there. We can see the stars with our bare eyes. Sometimes we can see comets. We can see the other planets, but we've built technologies to perceive them in greater detail. Some of them that use methods like photography or television, so that we can see and distribute the images. So why don't you talk about technologies of the eye and the mechanisms that humans have invented to peer deeper into reality of outer space, which is one of the most inaccessible places to humans naturally.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I love thinking about the continuities between, artistic representations and scientific ones actually both being about getting at the truth of a subject. And, so after I graduated, right, I had spent all of this time painting. And this was how I got interested in space. I wasn't like a space person prior to this, but I got an internship at NASA Ames.
And NASA Ames is actually pretty focused on astrobiology.
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
Moffett Field in Silicon Valley in California.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As of recent history, kind of positioned itself as like, the NASA Research Center for Silicon Valley, right? It does a lot of, different small satellite and small technology projects also. The other thing so NASA Ames was an NACA center, which was the aeronautical regulatory body in the 1930s that, was regulating aeronautics and aviation as an early technology. And so one of the things that Ames has architecturally are wind tunnels, which are just the most bizarre structure. It's like, brutalism could never approximate, the austerity of the interior of a wind tunnel. And
how big are they?
Oh my God, they're gosh, we'd have to look up the actual like parameters, but they, they've always kind of reminded me of like a modern brutalist cathedral, because sort of the way that the way that they're designed, right? They have these kind of like gentle, like swooping curves, but you're so dwarfed by them. They're so grand. And they're usually just, reinforced concrete. And so, yeah. So when you're inside of one, the experience is truly cavernous. And it's, in my opinion, I think kind of sounds like the interior of a cathedral, but, the history office at Ames is inside of one of the decommissioned wind tunnels. It's incredible. And one of the things that they have inside of the history office, like it's a room with just a bunch of, it's got a bunch of paintings on the wall, right? And I was an intern and just coming off of, earning an art degree where I was really interested in painting. And one of the things that they have hanging up on the walls is all of the artwork that's in that collection. And it is a very heterogeneous mix of astronomical illustration, so like utilitarian image making, and
what do you mean, like diagrams of planes, the insides of machines?
Less technical illustration, more like but you're getting to the heart of the question, right? Like, what does it mean for something to be a utilitarian image, for something to be useful, right? Most of it was like illustrations of unmanned interplanetary satellite and probe missions, like specifically that Ames was involved with, like in the late 1970s. And so a lot of these illustrations that I like still remember, the illustrations that were most striking to me were of Pioneer Venus probes like descending onto the surface of the planet. And I was so, getting back, this is a really long-winded answer to your question about technologies of the eye, right? I was so curious about how this image was manufactured, right? I was so curious about how, why was it that my knee-jerk reaction was to describe this image as photorealistic, right? Like, what does that even mean, right? Like, photography has its own very, zigzagged aesthetic trajectory. Like daguerreotypes look really different from like high-resolution photographs. Like, what does photorealism even mean?
Right, and daguerreotypes were the technology that is considered just before the camera in the the mid to late-ish 19th century, especially by Louis Daguerreotype.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So
yes,
it was a really,
Daguerre,
yeah. So really, really early photographic process, right? And when you see it's like it's like your sort of quintessential old-timey photograph, right? Of like, yes, a photograph.
The streets of Paris.
Exactly. And so those photographs look really different from like a high-resolution photograph.
In photography, the primary aim is to reveal the real through precise detail that optically matches the object as closely as possible.
Right. And so like in scholarly circles, right, like what does it mean to like truly index reality, right? Like give something like a one-to-one representation. And so getting back to this space, this archive at NASA Ames, right? On the walls were things that were, according to the institutional boundary hygiene, illustrations, like visualizations, right, of the space environment. But the other thing that's in that archive are works of art, like capital F fine art, that were commissioned for the NASA Fine Artists Cooperation Program, which was started in 1963, right? And so the space, I think, is really powerful because you walk in and there are images that are created by artists for this fine arts program, and then there's images created by illustrators to like depict a phenomenon in this really neutral way, right?
To kind of like bridge what scientists thought was in space with what they could imagine to be in space. Can you describe some of these images and why they were commissioned? Like, how were they tools of knowledge making before we could go there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so I think that for me the most profound difference. So. And I can get into the aesthetics of what these astronomical illustrations look like. Like a lot of them, will feature like a piece of hardware and then like the atmosphere or the landscape of like whatever celestial subject they were approaching, right? So lots of like encounter paintings, paintings of landers like on the surface of things. At Ames in particular, that's also space station illustrations, which are really incredible, which we can talk more about. But for me, I think, the most profound difference was actually not in the content of the images, but rather the authorship. There was this tendency to characterize the fine art. So like, the shorthand for the fine art was often the name of the artist. So like, that is a Rauschenberg, or like, oh, that's a McCall. Whereas with the scientific illustrations, it was by subject, like, oh, that's Pioneer Venus, or that's Voyager. And that relationship, that like anonymizing, the sort of the putting in the third person of the artist, I thought was so fascinating. So the genre of images that I'm talking about are things that get described as the artist's representation, right? And that was really sort of what led me to this interest in depictions of space, right? Because space is fundamentally the most unseeable subject, right? It exists at a scale that borders on the imperceptible, right? It's such a great reminder that the light as we know and love it, right, exists in so much broader of a palette, once you move beyond our atmosphere. And so, I think that going back to this question of, what does it mean to produce a realistic looking image of something? Once you move past that, into the space environment, it's a term, it's a phrase that becomes fundamentally meaningless, right? And that's really sort of when this for me starts to turn into a cultural project, right? Like an ethnography of different illustrators and how they work in tandem with scientists, but how accuracy is constructed and how it functions and has to be socially stabilized.
And so this was, these illustrations started in the earliest days of NASA, in the space age, and very much drove the public imagination of what NASA should do. Let's land on the moon. Maybe one day we could go to Venus. Maybe one day we could go to Mars. So can you talk about the mood of the space age for at the time, and how these illustrators were tasked with defining that mood and then also promulgating it as a promotional tool for this new agency?
Yeah, I mean, it goes through. I think that it's a style of image making that goes through a couple different periods, I would say. I think and others, I think, could actually make good arguments about this starting earlier in a place like the 19th century astronomical observatory, right? I think in the American context, without question, Chesley Bonestell is the origin of this as an aesthetic phenomenon, right?
So tell us about him.
Yeah. Chesley Bonestell is an interesting character. His, I guess that he had an aunt who tried to claim that Bonestell was French for to the stars or something. It's actually Dutch for beanstalk.
I mean, that is kind of.
Yeah, it's also celestially aspirational.
Yeah.
Growing towards the stars.
And also powerful image.
Imagine. No, truly. Yeah, I mean, he the man lived a long time. He lived to be about, I think, 98 years old. So he had several very, he had two very full careers before arriving at astronomical illustration. He was born in San Francisco, but he lived through the San Francisco earthquake, got an architecture. I don't think he ever got the degree, but he studied architecture at Columbia, and that was where he learned about mathematizing images, learning perspective drawing. And then after the San Francisco earthquake, he moved back to the West Coast to help, rebuild. So there's a lot of actually really iconic buildings in San Francisco that he helped design. Most famously, he did I don't know about all, but he did most of the architectural drawings for the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s. And the images are really something. I actually really highly recommend looking at them because they're really stunning. And I think that that's really a through line through this man's career, right? Producing images of things that don't exist yet or that we haven't actually yet visited to show the customer that they're going to get something for their money. And that's so his first career is as an architectural draftsman. The economy collapses in 1929. So he packs up and tries his luck in none other than Hollywood, California. He moves to Los Angeles.
The classic parvenu story.
Exactly. Because the golden age of Hollywood made it as so that, this was one of the parts of the country that was unaffected, comparably unaffected by the Great Depression, right? And so he did all of So this process of architectural drawing, he then translates into a special effects skill in cinema that's known as matte painting. And matte painting is basically
matte?
Matte, yeah,
matte.
M-A-T-T-E. And a matte painting is functionally a backdrop painting that is made to simulate the immersion in like a constructed set or like filming on location if your film studio doesn't have the budget to film in a place like that. So he did the matte paintings for Citizen Kane.
Wow.
Yeah. A lot of really famous movies from the 30s. Swiss Family Robinson, bunch of other films. And while he's there, the other thing he starts doing is model building. So like building models of things and then photographing them to like make the paintings look realistic. And this is actually what I think makes Bonistel the father of astronomical illustration. The thing that he learns that I think was absent from illustrations of celestial environments in, say, the 19th century astronomical observatory is the fact that he learns by way of his time in Hollywood to paint backdrops of things that look continuous with film footage of human actors, right? That there's like a continuity between these two planes of reality, right? And so he learns about camera angles and which camera angles look most natural to the human eye, right? And for audiences that by the 40s and 50s, right, we're used to going to the movies, right? Like that looked so much more compelling and so much more realistic in this new framework, right, than older types of illustration.
So there are many, many stories about the realm of outer space and how humans have imagined it over millennia. We live in a time where we can send up really complicated telescopes that are super precise, that can unpeel layers of the universe back to almost the beginning of time and space itself. Can you tell us, Lois, a little bit about how ways of seeing the sky, how ways of imagining places in outer space has fueled by awe, driven new kinds of orientations and ways of seeing outer space?
Gosh, it's a subject that is so culturally ripe because of this projection of, things like the heavens, right? As this, like realm that, represents like literal ascendancy, right? But that, we sort of come to associate like metaphysical ascendancy with, that it's tough to generalize. The way that I have sort of always narrated this for myself is that space, in any cultural context, really functions as a sort of cultural Rorschach test, right? That it's like, what you're seeing is not necessarily the heavens in like a neutral way, right? But rather how a particular society or group of people, right, is using that as a sort of sounding board for meaning making.
So, yeah, and just a few examples about that. Thinking back to the ancient Greeks and these concentric circles that went from the mortal and the earthly to the extraterrestrial and the celestial and the cosmological, those were that drove scientific research for over 1,000 years. And how that particular setup of the solar system was deeply embedded in Christianity and in the imagination of like the ordering of the universe by God, especially. So I'm thinking about how paradigms of outer space and how we orient ourselves to it have evolved over time. So moving from a terracentric universe, and Earth is at the center of the whole universe, and then a shift to seeing our solar system as a heliocentric solar system, a heliocentric universe. And the observations that astronomers had made for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years were all trying to shoehorn their observations, these anomalies, back to Ptolemaic astronomy, and things weren't working. Like Mercury in retrograde, it doesn't work in these models. And so there were all of these like patches that astronomers at the time were having to do. And what the mathematical reality, seeing the universe as it is, required not just like a different way of observing things in outer space, but a conceptual shift also to what might be possible and what went against the norms at the time. So I'd love for you to talk about how the history of kind of reconfiguring how we see outer space, and in the space age especially, but also now we have the James Webb Space Telescope. How are technologies of perception changing how we see ourselves in the universe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that actually makes me think a lot of your work, Claire, on changing definitions of life. That I think that all humanists should be working on the search for life in the universe.
Same. Duh.
Because it's so radically disorienting, right? Contemplating, it's like what if the carbon-based model, right, that we've been so, weaned on? Is that a phrase that exists?
Yeah.
Raised on?
Yeah. Yeah. Another powerful image. Okay.
Is so contingent on that as a format. So, I think that, were I to speculate on, an astronomical, astrophysical revolution on the scale of the Copernican one, right? I think that that's what I would gesture to, right? And that's, because it's something that feels so straight out of science fiction, right? But people have been sort of getting at it in roundabout ways.
What do you mean?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Stanislaw Lem, I'm thinking of Solaris, I'm thinking of N.K. Jamison's Fifth Season, the way that science fiction has been so turned on to this idea of the planetary as a living entity, right? That maybe we've got the scale wrong of what counts for things to be alive. And so, yeah, that to me feels as radical of a departure as oh, wait, actually the sun is at the center and not us. But just to go back to your point too about Ptolemaic astronomy, right? There were still, even after we figured out that the sun was at the center, right? There were still fishing boats that used Ptolemaic models, right?
Totally.
To navigate. And so in that context, what does it matter? And I think also this speaks to this impulse, I think, to use the heavens in whatever way works for you.
I love that you invoked the concept of the planetary. So it's not just looking out, but looking at Earth from outer space, which has fundamentally changed how we see ourselves as living beings in the cosmos, and more thinking about Earth as a whole organism or a whole planetary system. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about where you're thinking is with that? How does seeing Earth in a new way engender a reorientation to life generally?
I think in that case, it's a little too early to tell. In the context of my own work, one of the things that I have been endlessly fascinated by is the lingering iconography of the frontier, right? Which is something that, now looking back on, the connective tissue between representations of space that resonate with ideas of manifest destiny, right? That sort of suggest.
And tell us about how you think of the frontier and what is manifest destiny applied to the stars.
So manifest destiny sort of emerged from this famous lecture that Frederick Jackson Turner gave in the 19th century about the closing of the frontier, right? And he really
the American frontier and going west and
yeah, exactly. That there was something about this engagement with the rugged that was fundamental to this nascent democratic project, right? That it was the expansion that made America, something distinct from the old worlds of Europe. And it's a pretty anxious accounting of well, what's going to happen now, right? And I think that in many ways, I think that many depictions of outer space have sort of embraced this format of oh, okay, well then the outer space is the sort of the natural continuation of that, right?
So we've conquered the West, and now we're going to conquer the stars.
Yeah. And it's so, the reality of it is that it's so much more complicated than that, right? There's so much that happens between this lecture by Frederick Jackson Turner, right, and say the onset of the space program, right? You have the emergence of the Western, right? Which becomes an internationally legible trope for people, right? It's sort of characterized by these like dry, arid landscapes that have this very visible geology, right? And coincidentally, that's something that becomes really useful for, people who are trying to depict the geology of alien planets, right? It's for many of the illustrators in this story, the thing that makes it easier to produce realistic looking depictions of the space environment is to go and observe it with the naked eye. But since you cannot physically go to these places, the best approximation is the West, simply by virtue of the fact that so much of it is not covered by grass or trees or cities. And so you can actually see the geological processes that have shaped these landscapes, right? And so, but this is the paradox that's at the center of this project that to me is the most challenging and the most interesting, right? That like, how do you explain a set of images that are so resonant with like the 19th century American landscape painting, right? Which is, and there are art historians who have flushed this out much more than I, right? But that, the 19th century American landscape painting, right, which is so preoccupied with the sublime. Many of them were made on U.S. geological surveys or informed by images that were taken on those types of surveys, right? And this sort of new genre of the astronomical illustration, right? Like, if you jumble a bunch of them together, sometimes, they look like they could be a part of the same set, right? And how do you explain that, right? How do you explain, as a historian, when you take a step back from something, a scenario in which you have a group of actors that are working on a set of images that end up bearing such great resemblance to an earlier set of images that are so loaded with meaning in the context of the United States, but that for them are fundamentally an earnest attempt to just see something in a really neutral way, right? And that's sort of where, I think, again, we have to remind ourselves that meaning is culturally constructed, right? It's not one person being like, and now I will make an image that makes this look like this. And so everybody's going to get that, right? Like, I think that, it's one of those challenging moments in the study of history where you really kind of have to look to, forces that exist in this ether, and try to unpack what they are.
So another mode that you're an expert in, Lois, for kind of bridging the distance between the real and the imagined is not just visual, but storytelling. So can you talk a little bit about how you see science fiction's role in shaping the imagination of outer space?
I also came to science fiction late. The most fruitful sci-fi I have read in terms of, I love science fiction now, but I think that the most helpful for me, science fiction has been tremendously helpful for me to think through a lot of these questions because it offers a third vantage point, right? To sort of step outside that system and sort of contemplate it in its whole, right? I think that, for me, one of the big motivating questions of this project is, why is it that if we've done so much work to try to problematize or contest colonialist rhetoric, that still is the predominant format with which we approach the space environment, right?
What do you mean?
I think this is true in a lot of commercial aerospace, right? This sort of, and I think it's true of the fact that the space Western is kind of a genre, right? That sort of the traditional space opera, and the American Western in film, right? Like they share a lot of the same tropes. I think is evidence of the continuity with which, sort of picking up where Frederick Jackson Turner kind of left off. But there's very few alternatives to that model. And one of the places, and my work, right, is so much about, because I'm interested in artists making representations of things, right? I'm interested in people who actually didn't get degrees in the sciences, right? But who went to art school, who then got tapped to use a different type of expertise, a pictorial expertise, to make an image that looked believable, right? So I'm interested in the scientific illustration. I'm interested in images that are billed as utilitarian, that are billed as functional, and rereading them as cultural artifacts, right? Like, what are the cultural tropes that get baked into these things that then we pass off still as neutral and objective, right? And so what, science fiction has been tremendously helpful, once again, for sort of stepping out of those tropes. And Octavia Butler's work has been especially helpful because, well, for one, science fiction in this sense, it's literature and non-pictorial. And so you get far less of an emphasis on like what the look of space is when you have textual descriptions. But I really think that space in Octavia Butler's, sort of collective body of work, right, is about diaspora and fleeing from a planet that has been subject to either like environmental or capitalist cataclysm, right? And it's not a good time. It's not, I just wrapped up a fellowship at the Huntington Library where I got to spend some time with the Butler papers. And one of the most fascinating things in her archive is the unpublished manuscript for Parable of the Talents, which was going to be the third book in the Parable series.
Which is her most famous
Which
series.
is her most, yeah. So Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents are probably her two most famous books. But yeah, so this manuscript is really fascinating because if people are familiar with the Parable series, spoiler alert, they do try to go to space. And Parable of the Trickster is the third book, where the community at the center of this series settles a planet. And it's the manuscript where Octavia Butler is grappling with the realities of space settlement.
So in a way, she was kind of writing against the dominant narratives of the space age.
Yes. Yeah. It's and the way that I describe this too is that I think that so much of what we think of when we think of 20th century science fiction, the hard sci-fi is so concerned with the hardware of space exploration, like the technical parameters. And I really see Octavia Butler's science fiction as a science fiction that's concerned with the social sciences. So like the architecture of like how we build community, right? And like how people fit together, which is a difficult question. It's a hard question. Like I remember when I was interning at Ames, my direct supervisor was hired to work on the shuttle program. So in the 1980s, NASA attempted to economize space travel by developing the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle as a go-between between this orbital lab and the surfaces of Earth.
And it's now at Kennedy, right?
Yeah. Well, so there's, I think we have 4 of them still. There's one here in Los Angeles, one at Kennedy, there's one in New York, and then one in DC at Uber Hazy. Yeah. So Yvonne Clearwater, my old supervisor, she was the person who hired me at NASA when I did this internship the first time. She had worked, her degree was in environmental psychology, and she worked on isolation and confinement. And she told me that she had basically like 2 job offers after she finished her degree, one of them to build isolation and confinement cells in prisons, and the other one to help NASA like contemplate human psychology in a high stress environment.
Pretty easy choice.
I think it was a pretty easy choice. I think Yvonne would say it was an easy choice. But the question that NASA was really interested in was, like how long can you reliably predict the human behavior in a high stress environment, right? And according to Yvonne, the answer is like about 9 months, right? And so if you're contemplating something like Mars travel, right, where like it's going to take almost 2 years to get there, and as soon as you get there, you basically have to start digging to like, create some sort of subterranean habitat so that you don't roast from the radiation, right? Like that counts as a high stress environment, and one in which you are suddenly extremely dependent on the people around you, right? Community becomes a technology, I think in a much more explicit way. I think it's one here too, but I think that we forget that. And I think that was something that Octavia Butler was really keyed into. And so all of this to say that I think that like, again, like focusing on, themes of diaspora, going somewhere and never being able to return, and being suddenly so reliant on the community that's around you. In Octavia Butler's case, these communities were often intensely multi-ethnic, and interdependent. And, I think it does offer a real contrast to the more problematic elements of, again, the rhetoric of the colonization of space.
So who's Octavia Butler?
Yes. So Octavia Butler was a science fiction writer who was from Altadena. She was local, and she's often lauded as the first commercially successful Black science fiction writer, which is a title I think that she took issue with a little bit. Just because it was occasionally something that she found tokenizing. But in her telling, she got to science fiction because she watched this movie called Devil Girl from Mars, which she found on videotape.
What year was this? And what is that?
Oh gosh, this was probably like some point in like the 1950s, 1960s. Yeah, that she found this tape, but she watched it and it was as bad as it sounds. And she was like, I think I could.
You mean like pulpy or
pulpy, definitely. Yeah, just like that's sort of that variety of science fiction that's like hot babes from a distant planet come to Earth because all the men on their planet have gone extinct. Know? It's a terrible resource problem. So, I think that she was like, wow, yeah, I could really do a lot better than this. And so she started writing science fiction really from a young age. And she won basically like every science fiction writing award that you can win. And then she also won a MacArthur Genius Grant. So, and she's really well known. Her most famous series is the Parable series. So Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Parable of the Talents has been coming up quite often, because it features, a Christian populist, right-wing presidential candidate whose campaign slogan is "Make America Great Again."
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so every once in a while when people read Parable of the Talents, they'll like text me and be like, "Wow."
And it's funny, Lois, just how prescient these authors can seem. The other science fiction writer who is coming to mind is Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yeah.
And they were both part of and witness to environmental focus in the 70s, and a lot of their work is about caring for Earth, but in science fiction context. And that's not the NASA's drive to put a man on the moon, and manned missions and like the single lone conqueror. Their stories, their science fiction was not about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The other person I'd loop in there too is Kim Stanley Robinson, right? People who are really interested in using science fiction as like.
So he's a Ministry of the Future?
Yeah. And the Mars trilogy, really famously. Yeah. Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, which sounds like a Dr. Seuss book when I say them all
Green
in
eggs
order.
and ham, yeah.
But
and he's alive and working today.
Yes, he is. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, to your point, yes. So Octavia Butler is certainly part of a movement in science fiction, right? That I think that is that stands in contrast to the Isaac Asimovs, and the Robert Heinleins of, like the 40s and 50s, who are very interested, who I think one could narrate, right, as being very interested in hard science fiction and like technical parameters, because they were trying to make arguments for space as a plausible landscape, as opposed to something that was the product of whimsy.
So I don't know about you, but I had the Hubble Deep Field as a big poster in my college dorm room, because it is so magnificent to see these galaxies billions of light years away, lensed by gravity, and with the James Webb Space Telescope, is yielding such rich research and images that are even more precise and sophisticated in detail than our beloved Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope. But as you know, better than anyone, that any image that you see of outer space is not only carefully staged, but also constructed using kinds of vision that are unavailable to humans. So ultraviolet or infrared, these are all on the electromagnetic spectrum, but they're not in the optical visual that we're seeing each other in. So in a way, a lot of these composite images are kind of like paintings. Like scientists have to make decisions about how to layer aspects of a celestial object, like a faraway galaxy, to present a reality back to Earthlings. So I'm wondering, can you talk about telescopes as not just like quad telescope as this seeing eye in the sky, but also vehicles by which scientists present reality back to humans?
Yeah, absolutely. So Beth Kessler has an incredible book about this. It's called Picturing the Sublime, where she traces in a really coherent way the influence of the 19th century landscape painting on the astronomers and visualizers whose job it was to make Hubble images coherent to people, right? Because exactly like what you're getting at, right? It's like, how do you, because I think that sometimes people hear constructed image, right? And it suggests artifice, right? But it's not that the images are fake, right? They're still recording, what is tantamount, what is a physical phenomenon, right? And, there's a machine that's interfacing with it, and we're visualizing it in some capacity and trying to turn that into an actual image. One thing that I use to describe the construction of an astronomical image to people and students when I've taught this in the past is like the difference between a Jackson Pollock painting and like a landscape painting, right? That a Jackson Pollock painting, right, has a lot of visual information in it, but it tends to sit sort of on the surface of the plane of the image, like the splatter, right? Exactly. Whereas a landscape image is the visual conventions of it are such that it suggests depth, right? That you could move through the image in some capacity, right? When we're getting raw data back from a lot of these telescopes, it looks more like the Jackson Pollock painting. It looks just like visual gibberish, right? And we have to construct something that actually looks like something, right? And one of the things that Beth mentions in her book is that a lot of times these astronomers would give the Hubble images a landscape orientation so that we would read it as a landscape, right?
In what ways? Because a landscape is so different than like looking at hundreds of galaxies.
Yeah, right. Like giving it like just literally like a landscape aspect ratio, right? So that just the longest leg of the image is the bottom or the top and not the... Yeah.
Now I'm going to see that everywhere.
Oh, yeah. It's effective. It's a good tool. She also has a line in that book about how... there was a conscious effort to not use like flesh tones in like coloring these images, because then they start to look like orifices, right? Like, but it's true, right? Like, and I've done this before. I've spent a lot of time looking at Hubble images of the Horsehead Nebula, and it's true, the like coffee mug version of the Horsehead Nebula taken by Hubble, right? If you like turn it on its side or turn it upside down, right, it can look like any number of different things. It's actually like a surprisingly phallic image.
So we've come to recognize the shape of, for instance, the pillars of creation, these monumental towers of maybe will give birth to stars, and we can see early stars in it. And the structure of it is they're vertical towers.
Yeah.
And of course, in outer space, there's no
orientation.
There's no orientation, and you have to make the orientation. This reminds me of Earthrise. Will you tell us about that?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. That's my other favorite example of this as a phenomenon. So Earthrise is a really famous photograph from the Apollo program. It was taken during Apollo 8, which was famously the Christmas mission. They read a selection, I think, from Genesis as like part of a Christmas broadcast from the moon. But Apollo 8 never actually landed on the surface of the moon. It was just a circumlunar mission. So they just went around it, but they never actually landed. And Earthrise, the image, is a photograph of Earth taken by Bill Anders, and you can like just see the surface of the moon on the bottom of the image, right? And so, it's an incredibly powerful photograph, right? Because it sort of recreates what it's like to stand outside and look up at the moon, but it inverts it, right? Where you're standing on the moon and, sort of contemplating, what's on that big blue planet out there.
And exactly as you said, the other contrast is that the moon is dead and gray and lifeless and pockmarked, and then Earth is in shadow a little bit and is glowing with oceans in green, and behind it is like absolute onyx black, never ending on and on and on, the abyss. So yes,
and that's a fantastic point, right? I think that's a really critical piece of analysis. But the thing about Earthrise that makes it also like these Hubble images that we've been talking about is the fact that Apollo 8 never landed on the moon, so it was floating around the lunar surface. And so from Bill Anders' position on board, the surface of the moon would have been actually on like the left side of the photograph, not on the bottom, right? So the fact that it was flipped around that way was to suggest to the viewer, right, a landscape, right? To force this orientation that we're more familiar with, right, into the photograph.
And that was a choice that the NASA press office did after, like much later, after they had landed. So it was like a specific choice to frame the image that way,
right?
To literally frame it.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So the James Webb Space Telescope is so exciting for exoplanetary astronomers and cosmologists who are interested in seeing the atmospheres of other worlds and also the earliest layers of time of our universe. So it has this enormous range, and it's going to yield beautiful data for decades to come. So what's next on the docket? Like, what are you excited about? Or the horizon, rather?
Yes. Exoplanets, definitely exoplanets. So the Nancy Grace Roman Telescope scheduled to launch 2028. Really excited about that.
What are you excited about this telescope?
Yes. So it is pioneering a technology called a coronagraph, which has been described to me by people who are much more intimately familiar with the technology as functionally a thumb that we use to block out starlight so that we can better see the planets that are orbiting around it. It's a really difficult technology to master. It has to be extremely precise.
So corona being like the crown. So if you put like a perfect circle over the sun, you would still see some flares on the outside.
That's right. Or planets that are illuminated by the sunlight of a different solar system.
Got it.
Yeah. And one of the things that's critical for exoplanet research, right, is finding Earth-like planets around sun-like stars, right? That's sort of the critical equation. And the thing that I'm most excited about is, seeing what happens with this coronagraph technology for a telescope that's a little bit further down the road called the Habitable Worlds Observatory, which is, as the name suggests, being designed actively to search for the conditions of habitability out in the universe.
And Lois, this is so exciting because the technologies of perception that we're building and using are actually changing the very categories that we're building them to investigate. Like, what is habitable or what could be habitable for extraterrestrial life might look totally different than habitability on Earth, right?
Which, if we're talking about paradigm shifts, it's hard to imagine anything that would upend our understanding of science any more dramatically than that.
Right. So life on Earth is carbon-based, and we're based on, there's photosynthesis that produced an oxygen-rich atmosphere. But actually our sun, our yellow dwarf sun, makes up only 6% of the population of all possible stars. And it's only in the past couple of decades that we know that most stars have planets orbiting them.
Are you saying that our sun is not a sun-like star?
I'm saying that our sun is not usual. And so we have to expand what we think of as what is habitable in an alien context. Like, what's even a planet in an alien context? Like, what does sunlight mean in an alien world?
Absolutely. I mean, they're questions that really boggle the mind, right? Like, what are the conditions that can harbor life, right? And I think that there's deep existential and philosophical questions baked into that, and I think that there are deeply utilitarian questions baked into that too, right? Like the question of the conditions for habitability are a thing that we're so often confronted with on our own planet right now, right? And that's something I'm really excited about. Also, I will say, just, for any of the engineering nerds out there, it also represents an incredible task. One of the astronomers on this project described it to me as
the habitable worlds.
The habitable worlds observatory, the telescope, and then I think more specifically, like what we're asking of this coronagraph and why it's such a critical technology to the success of this project is that it's basically like if you're in a football stadium and the stadium lights are on and there's a lightning bug that's one human hair's width like apart from the stadium light, and the stadium is in San Francisco and you are in Denver, Colorado.
That's amazing. It's amazing precision.
Absolutely. And those are so it needs to be extremely precise, and it's working with like very different it's working with light on very different orders of magnitude, which is
I'm
really
just thinking, just a few centuries ago to Galileo's telescope and just seeing the moon as not this perfect celestial object that was pure and white and unmarked. And now we're going to see atmospheres of worlds at that level of precision. I mean, that's really, it boggles my mind too.
Totally.
Okay, so Lois, the Habitable Worlds Observatory is a great success. And you're running NASA at this point. Correct. So you were talking about how astronomers compile data into images that human sight is familiar with. So let's say in the future, the Habitable Worlds Observatory works perfectly at this level of precision, observes all of these alien stars and the exoplanets that are passing them. What would you see? Like, how would you paint it? How would you construct an image out of this data? Like, what markers of it would make it habitable, and how would you depict it for us right here?
If we were to discover like a living alien planet, right, that was like comparable to Earth and was like legible to us, right? I think that what the effort to pictorialize would find would be comparable to like I think everybody had this experience of a child, right? Of like, sitting and like contemplating the physical world around you and like trying really hard to imagine a new color, right? And like something that exists outside the box that you inhabit, right? Or like imagine a truly new animal, right? And then, being frustrated to discover that like the animal that you had attempted to invent was actually just a collage of like a couple different animals that you had seen before, right? That like to imagine the truly alien, right, is maybe an impossible task, like by definition, right?
And it's so funny, right? Because alien life is described as, well, it's life as we don't yet know it, but we'll know it when we see it.
But we'll know it when we see it, right? Exactly. And I think and this is sort of, I think, more a point that I'm making about like concepts and pictorialization than I am, the visual legibility of alien life. But I interviewed once Dana Barry, who was an illustrator, I guess trained as an artist, graphic designer, visualizer, but he worked on a lot of the Hubble Space Telescope visualizations. And I asked him what he thought the most difficult thing to illustrate was. And he told me about trying to visualize any aspect of the Big Bang, and how, the way that we think about it when we try to like picture the Big Bang, right, is like black, right? Like if we're imagining like a computer screen, right? Like the screen is black, right? And the Big Bang starts as like maybe like one white pixel, right? And then like emerges out from the white pixel, right? But like actually the computer screen doesn't exist, right? So how do you picture that?
And there was no sound, and there was also no like recombination hadn't happened yet. Like you didn't even have photons, so it was silent and it was dark.
Right.
Yeah.
But like not in the ways that we think of when we think of those things, right?
Right. I mean, it contained all of the matter of the universe and all the stuff that we don't know about, like dark energy and dark matter.
Right.
Which we can't express.
Exactly. And so, I think about that sometimes, right? And again, like I think that visualization is one technology among many, right? But it is one tool in the toolbox. And I think that like one of the tricky things about images is true of photographs, this is true of illustrations, it's true of paintings, is that when you have a final image, it belies the constructedness, right? It belies the artifice because you're just saying, what is this like coherent, scene or depiction or whatever, right? Like when you look at, like a beautiful polished, colored Hubble image, it belies how many different layers there are and how much work took
and how
to
many
interpret.
People
and how many people
Yeah.
worked on it. Yeah, exactly. And I think that we're seeing that with things like AI images now too.
So, Lois, I've learned I learned from you a lot about the O'Neill cylinders,
Yes.
and just what a potent image they created in the American imaginary that continues today in science fiction films. So tell us about Gerard O'Neill.
Yes. Yeah. So, gosh, this is another NASA Ames plug. But this was a part of, so Gerard O'Neill was a Princeton particle physicist who moved out to Stanford to do particle research.
This was like mid-century, 60s?
Yeah. And then in 1976, he helps architect a design study with NASA Ames that's, I guess, technically co-sponsored by NASA and Stanford, in which he advocates, I think in his view, plausibly, for the creation of a large-scale space station, like a habitable space station. And when I say large-scale, I mean like 10,000 people living and working in space.
It's like a mini planet.
Yeah, functionally, yeah, just like strung up there at L5.
And you might want to tell us what L5 is.
Yes. So the Lagrangian points are points between the moon and Earth in which the gravity is stabilized. So it makes them really good candidates for things that you send up, but you want to hang out in roughly the same spot. So Gerard O'Neill had, this really grand vision for these space station interiors, and he was really interested in using there's a shape called the he sort of dubbed the Stanford torus, right? Which it's like it's a big tube, and then it spins, and then that generates gravity, so everything like sticks to the side. And he worked with a bunch of local artists who were in and around the Bay Area. Many of them who would later contribute to the illustrations that I was telling you about at the beginning of this conversation, or when we first started. And, I had the chance to interview one of the artists that he worked with, Don Davis, and he told me that he modeled the interior of this space station after Atherton, which is a suburb, a pretty wealthy suburb of San Francisco.
Yeah, like one of the wealthiest.
Yeah, it's where Steph Curry lives.
Cool.
So it's this wealthy suburb, because Gerard O'Neill's whole thing was that it was gonna be not a cramped space station. It was going to be so emblematic of like the bounty of the space environment, right? Like we were going to use minerals that we had collected off the surface of the moon, right? Sunlight would be so abundant, right? Because we could collect it whenever we want. So it would be really beneficial for things like agriculture, like agricultural yields would be through the roof, and construction would be really easy because you weren't working against Earth's usual forces of gravity to be able to like lift things and hoist them around, right? And so it had all of these advantages that he had sort of earmarked as like the most worthy follow-up to the momentum generated by the Apollo program, like the successes of the Apollo movement.
And the Apollo program famously was a series of missions that went to explore the lunar surface and and around the moon. It and also, Lois, you pointed out to me that in this particular imagination of space, the illustrator inspired by O'Neill, Dan Davis, portrayed this as like pastoral America.
Yes.
Like the heartland, like agriculture. So it was a different kind of landscape than the Western frontier, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty suburban one. Sometimes, and then in other illustrations, it is like a truly rugged, like, oh, that's an alpine forest that we have like copied and pasted into the context of a space station. And it's interesting, and again, because I think I think that what's crucial here, right, is that like ideologically, it was an aesthetic choice that spoke to O'Neill's contention that this type of space station was going to be like the interface between like human life on Earth and the latent wealth of the space environment, right? Which like maybe we would extract that using the government as a vehicle, but also maybe we would use commercial entities to do that. Like, people were pretty disenfranchised with the government in the mid 1970s, right? Like keep in mind, this is like post Watergate, post Pentagon Papers. The war in Vietnam was intensely unpopular, right? It was the government,
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people in the space sciences, right, like broadly construed, were disappointed in what they saw as like the stalling of the Apollo program. It was technically concluded prematurely, right, by the Nixon administration, which I think a lot of people were disappointed by. We landed on the moon 6 times, but nobody ever remembers the other 5 times, right?
Yeah.
It's really kind of just Apollo 11.
Yeah.
Which I think sort of speaks to, the sort of the waning interest in space activities.
And Lois, how do those visual narratives and also ideological narratives, how have they continued or how are they being revivified? Like I'm thinking about in Interstellar,
Yes.
which is a recent movie, and we see these O'Neill cylinders. So why don't you tell us about how the visuals have moved through time? As a historian, how do you judge this current moment of space exploration in terms of the transportation of a visual narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for viewers who've seen Interstellar, right, this is also, I guess, a minor spoiler alert, but towards the end of the film, right, you see the space station, right?
And the premise of the film is that that planet Earth is blighted. They can't grow anything.
That's
like
right.
The crops have failed. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And so this space station sort of represents the last vestiges of humanity, right? It's funny because again, it does sort of like I'm like remembering like a sort of dizzied Matthew McConaughey, like seeing like children playing baseball, right? It's like inside of this space station, which is so interesting, right? Because at the beginning of the film, he sort of starts on this corn farm. It is very pastoral, right? It is very like, what you were gesturing at with like sort of, the agrarian nature of the American heartland. and that, and this space station, right, becomes a way to sort of extend that into the future indefinitely, right, by the availability of these materials. And so, like, I read that as something that's evidence of the cultural resonance of that as an image, right? Because the only space station, the space station interior that we're actually most familiar with is the ISS, right? Which is cramped. It is an economized interior, right? It's precisely the type of thing that Gerard O'Neill was trying to make to contrast with.
And the deterioration of that object as a multinational gathering place for spacefaring people is indicative of space being more and more politicized. So can you tell us, well, there's just like a lot of moments now that go back to what you were saying about the 70s, this distrust of government. There's a perception of government bloat. And there's a move to privatize and militarize space. Mm-hmm. So how do you see those narratives being recycled now from the space age into now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I think that, like, in some senses, right, this image of this pivot from government space flight to commercial space flight is fallacious, right? It's actually not, because the government spaceflight in the context of the United States by way of an organization like NASA, right, has always been, and this was true also during Apollo, right? It has always been collage of government efforts with private ones and universities, right? It's always sort of been a revolving door. And so it's interesting, right, that like we're sort of narrating this moment as, the sort of the turn towards the commercial as like distinct from that history, right? And I think that there are very real changes that are happening, right?
Like what?
I think that low Earth orbit is a really interesting example of this. I think the fact that like Leo represents like a...
So LEO meaning?
Yes, low Earth orbit. That's right. Yeah. It's like a telecommunications infrastructural realm, right? That kind of collapses
like a
the
film
usual
over Earth.
Yeah. But that collapses the usual geopolitical boundaries of Earth, right? There's not like territory in Leo, right? It's all kind of like smushed together on like one even plane, right? And now, like to complicate things even further, right? Like it's characterized by not just the presence of nation states and national security interests, right? The first satellites that we had were spy satellites, but now it's private companies, right? It's companies like Starlink, OneWeb historically, that need really big and robust satellite constellation arrays. So I think that we're definitely living in a moment where like the politics of space is complicated, and I think that it's going to be tough for legislation to keep up with how that all gets regulated.
Yeah, so we've been talking about these telescopes as really monumental devices and tools to see the universe in a new way. But we have to piece together their data in order to visualize the Crab Nebula or something. Whereas AI is a tool that more and more often people are ascribing agency to artificial intelligence's text-to-image generators. And I don't quite think that's true. How do you see the role of AI in kind of shaping pictorial representations of real objects in space or otherwise?
Yeah. I mean, it's a super interesting moment, right? Like in some senses, right? Like I spent like the better part of the last decade, right? Like writing a book about how images that we thought were trustworthy were just as constructed as anything else, right?
Like, what's an example?
Like images, like these illustrations of the space environment, right? Which, developed a whole aesthetic to signal their scientific trustworthiness, right? Like the Guild of Illustrators that I write about develop a really robust toolkit to make sure that they were functionally standardizing the images that they were coming out with, right? But again, it's a social tool, right? It's not a scientific one. And I think this is true also with the way that we see, photography as being a trustworthy format. And so, I think that what this moment of first, what we were calling deep fakes and now AI images.
And what is it? I mean, this feels like everything is moving at such a rapid pace. Feels a long time ago, but it wasn't. So can you describe how deep fakes emerge and kind of the problems that they caused?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, deep fakes, I think initially caused a lot of political anxiety
because they're representations of familiar people, but never something that those people actually did.
Yeah, exactly, right. There's a deep fake of Richard Nixon reading the speech that he wrote in case all of the Apollo 11 astronauts died, right? And you can watch that just on YouTube, and it's a deeply unsettling speech, but in terms of approximating probably what that television broadcast would have looked like, that's pretty good. And so trustworthiness in media, right, is a pillar of journalism and journalistic integrity, and so I think it's deeply anxiety inducing for people to to not be able to trust images as this sort of one-to-one documentation of again, some sort of objective reality, right? But again, I think they've always been constructed, right? I think that I'm interested also in early photo editing techniques, right? Developed by the CIA and the KGB to edit photographs, to edit people out of photographs that were made using analog tools. I think that there's so many examples of this, right? There's so many examples that belie the sentiment that is captured in a statement a photograph is worth 1,000 words, right? That, if, take a picture, it'll last longer, or, whatever, all the different turns of phrase that suggest the photograph's supremacy as the primary documentation of our visual lived reality.
And so with AI that can be trained on those images,
pre-existing
images that can copy or mimic a famous artist's style. What does that training process and what do those machine algorithms do to the identity of an artist and the nature of a painting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still kind of to be seen. I mean, yeah, I think that my instinct is to gesture broadly to the political economy of the situation as opposed to any sort of conceptual, oh, what does this mean for the image making? Of just, art is still a type of labor. And a lot of these people, are really closer to, well, I mean, they're, I get so tired of distinctions between fine art and illustration, right? But it's a very real distinction for many of the people who are doing this work, especially through the 70s and 80s. But the whole reason why the Guild of Artists that I write about even formed in the first place was because publishers of magazines were slow to return paintings back, and they wanted to get a lawyer on retainer. It was very much, but it was a reason that was very much rooted in the exploitation of labor, right? And we have very little, we have comparably so few labor protections now in the United States that I think that
and AI is complicating those conversations too.
Oh, tremendously.
Yeah.
I know AI is definitely going to be used on the processing of the vast amounts of data that's coming out of these telescopes. I don't know that that's going to be used to cohere into an image the same way. But yeah, I am interested in how AI can offer us the approximation of an aggregate image, right? That oh yes, I have taken 10,000 images and averaged them for you. And here is my like muddied, approximation of all of these different types of thing, right? Like, I think that will be just an interesting research tool to be like, okay, well, like what are the contours that happen? What are the contours that occur most frequently in these types of images, right? Just as like a counting tool. Like, will AI image generation shape how depictions of space are articulated in the future, right? And I think that, like, yes, absolutely, but it's harder, I think, to imagine depictions of space being distorted because it's so hard for us to catch glimpses of the unaltered subject, and so in some senses, space is like so postmodern in that way, right? Is it like it's always just going to live only in the constructed texts that we make about it, right? As opposed to like a physical, a physical place that we're encountering really directly. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I think that I'm honestly, like, even more so than like the impact of like AI image generation, I think that like the force that we should really be wary of is actually more just nostalgia, right? I think that really interrogating like why certain images feel more meaningful than others, or like why these comparisons of space to, something like a Western frontier feels so obvious and resonant. I think to me is actually a more interesting problem to contend with.
And nostalgia, of course, like it itself is constructed in the time that it's being made. It's a memory for things that either didn't exist or exist in the sense that you're creating them with nostalgia.
Right. And so it's like, so it's like its own hallucination.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
And, I think of like the Hubble Space Telescope images and the James Webb Space Telescope images. They're colorful and they're piercing, and they have this gemstone jewel-like quality to them. And of course, that's the result of choices that experts have made to show the public. And NASA JPL is the author of these. And like, do you think AI is going to pick up that particular style in order for us to imagine things we haven't yet seen, like nebulae, but also perhaps like alien worlds?
Could be. Yeah. I mean, like, I see so many continuities across the Webb images that we've seen with Hubble. I think some of the Webb images, like the Carina Nebula, right, that have been, sort of upheld as some of the most like blockbuster of, the output of the Webb telescope in like a public sense, right? Like a lot of them are images that we took already with Hubble, right? And we're getting like the same images, but like, look at how much more glittery it looks, right? Because we can see so much more detail, right? And so like, I think that even Webb is in many ways, for the stuff that's like being circulated as like, these attractive images of the space environment that are legible in a really in a really clear way. I think that those images are really responding to the aesthetic tropes that were worked out by Hubble. And so I think it does stand to reason, right, that, like that's a framework that we're going to continue to see, right? And I think that like, it's so permeated. Neil Marr has this great, he's got this great analysis of not Earthrise, what's the other Earth?
Blue marble.
The blue marble, right. He's got this great bit of analysis about the blue marble as like an icon for the environmentalist movement. And his take on it is that like part of the reason why it's circulated so broadly is just because like NASA's images are in the public domain, right? And so you don't have to like pay copyright on these images
and
to
it's
get
the most
permissions.
reproduced image ever.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. But like I think about that every time I like look on the internet and you can like buy sweatpants that have like space print on them, but it's always just like Hubble, or it's like, or now Webb, right? But it's these like, it's that look, it's that like black with like the jewel colored clouds and like glittery stars, right? Like that is now an aesthetic unto itself. I think even detached from like, I think that if Nancy Grace Roman or Habitable Worlds came back with like a totally different visual paradigm, we would still have that. I think that would still be an aesthetic that we associate with the space environment.
And it's become so, I've just associated what nebulae especially look like because of these two telescopes, that it elicits a really emotional reaction in me. So I have this like response to these images. So it's really interesting to think how to cultivate another kind of response with a different visual style that is, that NASA's producing of outer space objects. Like that's like a new feeling maybe in the future.
But whether or not the AI is going to give us something truly novel that will shape our expectations of the future, I think is yet to be seen, right? Like I still think back to the frustrated child and their like inadvertent chimera, right? When they're trying to imagine a new animal and they're just like, it's an eagle and a lion again. Right? Like, these things are not truly novel.
So do you think that something similar is inevitable with the future of outer space depiction? Text-to-image generators that are artificially intelligent, exactly as you were saying earlier, the image belies all of the constructedness underneath it, but and those themselves were generated by people who did early space illustrations. And so it seems to me to be this endless kind of metabolism. So how do you see the future of AI in outer space depiction, drawing on this legacy of illustration and representation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this is true of AI image generation writ large, or is a categorization I would still defend. Is that I think we think of AI image generation as being something that's like purely the output of a computer, right? That like actually does obscure the very real human inputs that are a part of that process, right? Sometimes non-consensually, right? Like people's bodies of work, used to train these technologies, in ways that, occupy a legal gray area that we haven't figured out, right? But even just talking about like the relationship of like, I don't know if people are still using this language, but I remember when, like DALL-E 2 first came out, like suddenly everybody on LinkedIn was like, I'm a prompt engineer. It's like an occupation suddenly. And, it's easy to lampoon, right? But I think that like, putting text in like an input, right? And then generating images out of that, right? Like it's still required, like there's still a human driving the car in a way that I would actually, so in histories of photography, there was a really similar debate about cameras, right? Of like, if you pushed a button on a camera, did you make the image or did the camera?
And this is what you talk about in your piece for Noema.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And the legal debate around that, I think, is really instructive for this moment, right? Because like one of the things that really helped shape the debate was reconceptualizing of photography as like a way of using a camera to draw with light, right? And I think that this, in this case, it's kind of a metaphorical application, but thinking about the AI image as something that is like kind of drawn by a human, but instead of using a pen, you use a computer, right? And so, the technology is also moving at a mile a minute. So who knows if that'll still be true
by the time this airs?
No, literally. But I think that's kind of what I hope.
There's also something just so deeply satisfying about making art personally that I don't think AI's experience. And I think that the question for the future, and maybe you agree, is how humans and technologies will just continue to influence each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The one positive thing, well, I'm sure there are many positive things, but one positive thing I think about AI image generation, right, is the fact that it lowers the barrier barrier to entry, right? Suddenly people who, felt, a type of like pictorial illiteracy, right, are capable of making images that they like and can circulate or are functional in a scientific context, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's nothing to sneeze at.
So how do pictorial styles get baked in to certain cultural moments that are then metabolized and then regurgitated over time? Like there's this inevitability that AIs are going to just continue to have these like baked in styles, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like whatever the computational equivalent of like subconsciously is, it's that, right? Of whatever it means to like ingest all of this information, right? And to like have the structure of it, like worked out in specific ways because it has to be, right? Because it's a limited data set by definition. You're going to see that eke out, I think, into whatever the output is. I think it just stands to reason. It reminds me of debates around like the use of AI determinations in like legal contexts, where, there was concern over the fact that the algorithm was also, it displayed a lot of the racial biases. The algorithm displayed the racial biases that were inherent in the data sets that had been used to train it. And, but the debate eventually became like, well, okay, we know that the computer judgment is flawed, but is it more racist than a human or less racist? And it was,
and how do you even compute racism?
Right. Exactly. And so, I think that like those are the questions that we're gonna, we'll have to work out, because I think that, I think data sets are always going to be skewed and always going to be limited in whatever context. And so I think like trying to recognize that as best we can and hoping that we avoid, the possible shortcomings that they could engender. But it's a tough ask to predict the things that aren't even on your radar yet.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about Fauvism and Matisse at the Fin de Siècle and how those artists were putting these crazy paintings that had super flat perspective into the academies, and people were filled with rage upon viewing these. And I just wonder if AI could ever come up with something that was so novel that it disrupted a cultural interpretation of what art with a capital A is, to that degree that it would inspire like equivalent passion.
Interesting, yeah. Right. I mean, in some sense, it kind of already has, right?
Yeah, right.
People are like, this is so bad.
Lois, such a pleasure. I always learn new space factoids when I'm with you about the space age and the future. So thank you so much.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much, Claire.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Bergruin, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.